Hi guys, my name is Leah Bustler and welcome to Courageous Speech. I'm so excited that you guys have decided to watch this video. I've been doing speech and debate for 4 years now, and this is now my 5th year in STOA. And today we're going to talk about cold reading, the new wildcard event for STOA. This video is supposed to sort of mirror some of the workshops and classes that Courageous Speech offers throughout the year. And for these classes, you pretty much really only need a laptop and Wi-Fi. They're usually done online, and you can figure out where those are at our website. I'm so excited that you guys are here, and we're going to basically be covering some of the basics for cold reading. We're going to be going over an overview, what cold reading is and what it's not, what you want to expect when you walk into the room, how the tournament goes. Then I'm going to be giving you some competition tips, what you want to do in the prep time that you have, what you want to do when you're performing, and then I'm going to be giving you some practice tips and an example of how a cold reading might go. So without further ado, let's jump straight into those tips. So cold reading is a wildcard event in STOA. And what wildcard means is it means that it is only an event for 2 years. It cycles in and then it cycles out. And all of these wildcard events are voted on by the entirety of STOA. Now, cold reading is not necessarily an interpretation event. It's not something that you act out. You don't have to have any prior acting experience or like all the interpretive event categories to do cold reading. Cold reading is actually under the limited preparation category. So for all of you guys out there who think that cold reading is about getting a script and acting something out on the spot, it's not. It's just about being able to read words on a page. Now, when you go to a tournament, when you go into the room, here are a couple of things, just the basics that you might want to expect. So for cold reading, you get 2 minutes of prep time. So when you walk into the room, you are either going to be handed or given the option of selecting one selection. Now, for all of the other limited prep categories, you get to pull 3 questions that you're going to answer. For cold reading, you don't get the option of choosing anything. You just pull one selection or you're handed one selection, and that's the one you got. But as soon as you pull that selection or it's handed to you, the timer in the room is going to click start in that little timer, and you have 2 minutes to prep. You have 2 minutes to go through that selection and maybe mark areas and different things that you want to do. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And then once you've gone through that 2 minutes of prep, you're going to stand in front of the judges, maybe say your name, say the order that you are in the room, and then start. Once you start, you need to say everything that's on the page. Usually there's going to be some sort of title and author. You need to say that. That is something that's on the page that you're supposed to read. You don't want to just skip to the meat of it. You actually have to say that everything that is on the page. Now, for cold reading, there isn't a time limit for this event. That is something that's a little bit interesting. I don't think STOA has really ever done that before, where they don't have a time limit for an event. But because they're just words on the page, you go until you finish everything that's on that page or two. The timer still will be starting and stopping the timer to see how long you went, but there's no time maximum, so you don't really have to worry about going over time. Now, for these selections that you're given, they're usually 400 to 500 words. So normally they'll have a 3 to 4 minute run time. So there is a kind of a goal time that you should be in, but there's no maximum time. You won't get a penalty for going above 4 minutes or going longer than 4 minutes. Now, as far as the selection goes, that's entirely up to the tournament director. STOA didn't provide a list of categories for them to choose from. Really, it's just up to the tournament director. If they want to do something from the Bible, if they want to do Christmas stories, or if they want to do tongue twisters, you have no idea. So as soon as you walk into the room and as soon as you pull that selection, that's when you know what you're going to get, unfortunately. You really don't have any idea until you actually walk into the room. For these selections, however, they do want all of the selections in the room, all of the options for all of the competitors per round to be similar. So that way the judges kind of have a way to compare them. So it's not something from the 17th century and then a modern piece. They all need to be from the same genre, from the same time period, or from the same author, so that the judges sort of have a benchmark of being able to judge the competitors, and so they all have a similar feel. Now, once you're done, once you've finished speaking, then you're going to actually hand that piece of paper back to the judges. with all of the other limited preparation events, normally you can take your topic slip of paper out of the room with you, but for this event you're going to actually hand that selection, that piece of paper or two, back to the judges so that way they can reference it and look at it if they thought maybe you skipped a section or if they thought you said something wrong or something of the like. So you're not going to keep that with you, you're going to give it back. So that's basically what cold reading the event is. It's under the limited preparation category, not necessarily an interpretive event. You need to say the title and the author, you need to say everything on the page, and you don't get to choose which one you want. You're just handed the selection or you pull one, and you have 2 minutes of prep time to sort of go through and figure out what you want to do. And that's what we're going to jump to right now, some competition tips and specifically some things you might want to consider doing or looking at during that 2 minutes of prep time that you do have. So one of the things I would suggest looking for, or maybe just making a mental note of when you get that selection, is the tone of the entire selection. On the ballot, I believe it says something along the lines of competitor speaks within meaning and purpose of the selection. It's basically the same phrase, or speaks with the proper tone. And here's what I mean by tone. If you have a very serious or solemn face or very tone in your voice, or if you sound really happy and super excited, now you need to have that be appropriate with what you're actually saying. So say your piece or the selection that you drew is about some little kid that has cancer. Now it would make sense to speak with a very solemn voice, speak a little bit slower, and speak with a little bit more of a sadder tone. It would be inappropriate for you to speak with a super high-pitched tone and speak super fast and be smiling all of the time. That wouldn't be appropriate to the piece that you were given. So you want to check and make sure as you're skimming the piece to see if you know what the tone of that selection is, so that way you're in sync with the words that you're actually saying. Another thing you might want to consider checking out is if that tone switches in the middle of the piece. So maybe in the beginning it's talking about that little kid that has cancer, but in the middle it switches to how that kid has been healed or how that kid has survived and is a survivor of cancer. Now in that section you wouldn't want to be talking with that negative tone anymore. You might want to have a little bit more of a bright tone in your voice, so that way you're in sync and in tune with the words that you're actually saying. So that may be something that you just want to make a mental note of. You maybe don't want to write that on the page, maybe you do, but you just want to be aware of how you want to be approaching the selection and how you want to be saying the words that you're saying. The second thing you're going to want to consider looking at is budgeting your prep time. So you only have 2 minutes to look through this selection, and this selection being read aloud is supposed to last between 3 to 4 minutes, and it's 400 to 500 words. You're not going to have enough time to read through the entire selection at your normal pace unless you're a super fast reader, and then go back and make marks on it for where you want to add emphasis. So really you want to budget your prep time. You don't want to read the entire thing word for word. You're going to want to read line by line, just skimming the sections just so that you have an overall understanding of what the passage is actually saying and an overall understanding of the flow. You maybe want to just read the first and the last sentence of each paragraph, and you just want to skim through the areas instead of trying to read the entire thing. And as you're skimming through, because you're not reading the entire thing, you'll have time to go back and look at areas that you might struggle with. Say there's a sentence that is super complex, or there's a word that you just think you're going to botch when you stand up there and try and say it. If you just skim through it, you'll have time to go back, or have time to pause and look at that word and look at that phrase and get a better understanding of it, so that way maybe you won't stumble over it when you're actually speaking in front of the judges. The third thing that you're going to want to do is to be comfortable with the very first and the very last line of the entire selection. The very first thing that you say and the very last thing that you say will have a lasting impression in the judge's mind. So say you get up there and you're standing with your piece in your hand and you completely stumble over the title and the author and the first couple of sentences. Then you're super strong in the middle, and then at the end, because you didn't have enough time to look at it, you start stumbling again. Now, unfortunately, the judges are going to remember the beginning and the end and all the stumbling that happened there, and not the super strong part you had in between. So you want to make sure that you have a really good first impression and a really good last impression, so that way that will stick in the judge's mind. The next thing that you're going to want to do is to mark areas of emphasis, and this is kind of what I was talking about earlier. You could maybe mark a troublesome word like I talked about earlier, or you could maybe mark different areas of a tone switch or different areas of emphasis. If there's a line or a sentence that seems to be set apart from the rest, and you want to say it with something special, say it louder or say it with a little bit more conviction, you can use different marking systems to do that. One example of a marking system may be different colored highlighters. If you want to say something super dramatically or something super sadly, then you can maybe use a blue highlighter and just highlight that sentence or highlight that phrase. And then if you want to say something with a bunch of joy and hope and happiness in your voice and face, you can maybe use a yellow highlighter to highlight that section. And you can just create a highlighting system so that way when you're standing up there in front of the judges and you look down, when you're reading that line, you know, oh yeah, I wanted to say that a little bit more dramatically than the rest of the piece. So a highlighting system could also work. You could also use circles. You could circle different phrases or different words that you want to emphasize. You could use different backslashes for pausing. So if you wanted to have a super dramatic pause at a certain point, you could write backslashes in there just so that you remember that you wanted to pause. You could underline different areas of emphasis, or even use musical dynamic marks. You could do a crescendo in an area that you want to get louder and a decrescendo in an area that you wanted to get really soft and maybe meaningful and quiet. So you can use just different marking systems that you come up with. You can even write in the margins if you so please. But really, the system just needs to work for you. You can make up something that's completely different than all of the things I just listed, or you can go ahead and try some of the things I listed. The system has to work for you and no one else. Your friend is not going to be standing over your shoulder and trying to read with you when you're in the competition room and trying to read your marks. It is just for you. So really create a system that works for you. Create something that works with your brain and how you work and how you roll. Just create something that jives with you. You don't have to do something that your best friend is doing or even that your club says to do. This system is for you to understand and for you to work with. So now we're going to move on to some performance tips or things you want to do when you're actually standing in front of the judges and you're actually standing there with your piece of paper and you're ready to rumble and you're ready to go. So the first thing that you want to do that you want to check is if you have good posture. Now, as I've been watching people that are doing cold reading and actually competing, I found that this is really important. And I think that this skips a lot of our minds when we're actually in competition because we're tired and we want to go take a nap and we're exhausted and we really don't remember about our posture and how our body is looking at the moment. So really just remember to keep your shoulders back and your head up and have good posture. It really has an effect on how the judges are perceiving your confidence and assurance in what you're doing. The next thing you want to check is if you're death gripping the page. And you don't want to do that. You don't want to hold the page so tightly with two hands. It makes you look really uncomfortable and it kind of constrains you to the box that you've put yourself in. If you hold the page with one hand, that allows you to gesture and have a free hand in order to do what you want. That's the next thing that you're going to want to look at is how you're holding the page. So you don't want to death grip the page, but you want to hold the page with one hand. And you don't want to hold it right in front of their face so that the judges can't see you, but you don't want to hold it so far down that you're looking down the entire time. You want to hold it about waist high and out, so that you can quickly look at it and reference it, but so that it's not blocking your face or so that your face isn't turned down so much that the judges don't get what you're saying and they don't see your face. Another tip that I've learned for cold reading through acting and theater is to mark your spot with your thumb. So once you've moved down from line to line, you can mark where you are with your thumb. So that way when you look up and look at the judges, when you look back down, you know where you are and you didn't lose your spot. That's just a little tip so that you don't lose your spot, so that you can look up and look down and you know where you are instead of trying to figure out where you had left off. The next thing you want to do is to utilize facial expressions. I think when we're all under the heat of pressure, we forget what our face is doing and forget what our face looks like, but your facial expressions can be super powerful in communicating the words that you were given on the page. And something that's really unique and really special about facial expressions actually is your eyebrows. Your eyebrows can change the entire tone of your face and what your face looks like. So utilize facial expressions, utilize how you're expressing your face and make sure that's in tune and in tone with what the words that are actually coming out of your mouth and what you're actually saying. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about is very important, and I think this is really key into being successful in cold reading, and that is don't double back. And here's what I mean by that. If you skip a line or if you stumble over something, don't apologize for it, and don't go back and try and redo it. All that's doing is bringing to the judge's attention that you made a mistake. And in cold reading, since it's really not about content because you didn't get the option of that, it's really about fluidity and speaking with a fluid manner. So as soon as you try and double back, and as soon as you try to maybe apologize or go back and re-say something, it brings that to attention in the judge's mind, and they remember that you made a mistake, and they remember that you maybe stumbled over something. So if you stumble, if you make a mistake, or even if you forget a section, keep on going. I would say don't go back and fix it, just keep going smoothly. So don't apologize for your mistakes, and keep going if you make a mistake, and don't let it affect the rest of your performance. So the next thing is to read the piece like you've practiced it 100 times. Now, you've most likely never seen this piece of work before in your entire life, and you probably have no clue what you're saying, but you're just faking it till you make it. But read it exactly like you would if it was your OO and you had practiced this 100 times before. You want to read it with the same amount of confidence, the same amount of self-assurance, and the same amount of intentionality as you would if you were doing a pre-prep speech in something that you were very, very familiar with. The next thing that you're going to want to do is to remember the basics. Now, in the heat of the moment, when you're super nervous or you're super excited, or maybe you make a mistake and you're kicking yourself in the foot, you want to remember the basics of speaking. You want to remember to project so that the judges can hear you. When I was in finals at these last 2 tournaments, I got comments about how I was too quiet, and that didn't even pop into my mind when I was speaking. I was trying to have a super solemn and quiet moment, but I ended up being too quiet so the judges on the side couldn't hear me. So something that you want to keep in mind is making sure that you project enough so that all of the judges in the room can hear you and can hear the words that you're saying. You also want to utilize pauses. Now, when you have a pre-prep speech, you can practice when you want to do those pauses, how long you want to do those pauses, but in the heat of the moment, you may forget that. But pauses are super important and can really make an impact on how your speech comes off to the judges. A pause here and there can really make the selection that you're reading come to life. Pauses are huge in communicating a message, and remember to utilize those. And actually, they can be super nice because when you pause, you can then be thinking about the next words that you're saying while communicating the message to the judges. So remember to project and remember to pause. Also, remember to breathe. Now, when you're speaking and when you're doing this cold reading event, it may be tempting to kind of just rattle things off and to try and go as quickly as you can, and you sometimes forget to breathe. I've seen people who have forgotten to breathe and then have to take this huge gasping breath before they go back and start speaking again. Remember to take time to breathe so that you can project properly and so that you're calm enough to actually deliver it with the meaning and intention you're supposed to. The final basic that you want to remember is to look at the judges. And I think this is key. This is very important, making eye contact with all of those judges. Because you're reading from a script, this is going to be hard. So when you practice, you're going to want to practice looking up. You're going to want to practice trying to remember the next couple of words when you're not actually looking at the page. And I think the more you look at the judges, the better. If you can memorize the very last line of that selection and then put that script down and just speak to the judges, that will speak volumes to you as a cold reading competitor. So really just remember to make eye contact with the judges and look at them. Don't just stare at the page the whole time. You want to make eye contact and you want to look at the judges. As I've said many times before, fluidity is key. As I was talking to some of the parents in my club who have judged cold reading before, they've said fluidity and not rushing are the 2 main things that they thought everybody needed to improve upon, or the things that they really took into consideration when they were ranking 1 through 8. Now, you don't have a time limit on this event, so don't rush. You don't have to rush through the entire piece. take your time, pause. At certain sections you can talk a lot slower than other sections. You can vary your rate, you can vary even the pitch in your voice, but you don't have to rush through because there's no time limit. Speak slowly and speak to the intent of the actual piece. One thing that I found is very helpful, and this is my last tip for performance here, is to imagine yourself in a different setting and the judges as different people. So say you're given a script that's a fairy tale story. You might want to imagine the judges as all kindergartners or first graders, and you're trying to tell them a story. You're trying to entertain them and make that fairy tale come to life. So those judges aren't the judges at a speech and debate tournament anymore. They're the kindergartners and the sixth graders in a school that you're maybe telling a story at. So you want to maybe put yourself in a different setting so that way you can speak with a different tone and different intention that the piece begs and that the piece wants. Or say you're given a very informational piece, something that's just facts and figures and statistics. You might want to imagine yourself in front of a group of CEOs, or imagine that you're giving the news somewhere. That will allow you to speak with the intentionality that will give you higher marks in cold reading. So just picture yourself in a different setting. You're not at a speech and debate tournament, you're somewhere else. And that will allow you to become more in tune with the selection and speak to the mood in the manner that you should. Now we're going to move on to accents. Now I said that this wasn't an event that had to do with interpretations, and it didn't really have much to do with acting. But when you're giving stories, when you're giving fairy tales, one thing that I found that makes you more competitive is the use of accents. So say you're telling a story and there's a French guy in the story and he has a bunch of dialogue. You might consider doing a French accent and making that person come to life. The entirety of storytelling is to entirety of cold reading is to bring that story to life, and to bring the meaning and the intention of the words that you're saying to life, and to entertain the judges with the words that that author wrote. So using accents is a really good key in doing that. You might want to consider mastering some of the basic accents. Some of the ones that I've come across that I've needed is a British accent and a Southern accent. Those are the only two I've had to use so far. Now I haven't done those in a while, so I think when I competed with them, they were a little shaky and they weren't as consistent as I would have liked them to be. But if I work on my accents and if I make sure that they're consistent, then I can do those in the cold reading room at a snap. So you might want to consider hammering a French accent and a German accent. And some ways that you could go about doing that is maybe going on YouTube with parents' permission. There are a bunch of YouTube videos telling you how to do the basics of a British accent or a French accent. Or even if you Google how to do a French accent or a German accent, there are different lists of different things that you can do to try and master that accent. One of the tips for mastering this accent, and specifically for cold reading, is to practice it with new material. Now I found that when I'm doing an accent, it's really easy for me to use that accent if I have a set of phrases that I can say. But once I try and speak and just list off stuff that I didn't memorize with that accent, then it becomes a little bit more difficult. And in the cold reading room, you have no idea what that character is going to be saying. So you can't practice it. So you want to practice that accent with a variety of new material. And you also want to practice switching between that accent and possibly a narrator voice or a different type of accent. Sometimes it's really difficult to get out of an accent and then go back to your normal voice. So if you practice switching between the two, it'll be more fluid when you're actually in the cold reading room and competing. So now we're going to move on to some practice tips. These tips are more for when you're not at the tournament, you're not competing, but you're at home and you're wondering how you might even want to practice this event because it's so limited prep. I have a few tips for you that you might want to consider checking out and even trying. So the first one is to practice with a variety of new material. This doesn't just apply to accents, but it applies to just practicing cold reading as a whole. Practicing with a variety of new material will allow you to have an array of experience and all of the possible caveats that a tournament could give you. So you have no idea what that tournament's going to give you as far as selection types. So if you practice all of the types of selections that you can possibly get, then you'll be good to go. Some things that you might want to consider practicing with is a newspaper or magazine old literature, new literature, scripture, poetry, and even tongue twisters. Now, I doubt that the tournament's going to give you tongue twisters, but if you practice with those, it'll really give you a head start and allow you to do something that's a little bit more complex. So that way when you actually go into competition, it'll be a lot easier. So if you get a really long tongue twister and practice with that, your tongue and your mouth will be ready to go for when you're given something that's a little bit easier. You also want to practice the type of selection that is most challenging to you. So say you're really good at giving cold reading on stories, but you're really bad at doing poetry. Now you can practice the stories all you want, but as soon as you're given a piece of poetry, all that practicing on stories is really going to do you no good. So you want to practice the type of selection that is the hardest for you and is the most challenging. So that way when you get into competition, you have already kind of worked through the things that you struggle with and you know how to approach it, instead of just fumbling through it when if you had given a storytelling piece, you would have been stellar. So you want to practice a different variety of material and practice the ones that are super hard for you, so that way you become stronger in the areas that you're weak, because you don't know what you're going to get when you walk into the room. The next thing you want to consider doing is videoing yourself. Now this is not strictly just for cold reading. You can do this with any event, debate included. You can do this with all your interpretation events. You can do this with apologetics, with team policy, and Lincoln Douglas. This is not something that is just limited to cold reading. But when we're competing, honestly, I don't really know what I look like when I'm standing up there speaking. Everybody else can know what I look like but me, because I'm me. Now, if I video myself and I watch it, I can see all the little things that I'm doing. Maybe I sway a lot when I'm speaking, or maybe I bobble my head. I would have no idea unless I filmed myself and watched it. So filming yourself is a really good tool in order to figure out some of the little nuances that you're doing that you're unaware of. But once you've filmed it, there are two other things you can do besides just watching yourself give a speech. You can turn the audio off of that video that you created, and then you can just watch your movements and see if your movements are communicating the intentionality and the purpose of the selection. You can see if you do the same hand gesture over and over and over, if you do the same thing again and again and again, or if you do something that may be distracting. Without the audio, it allows you to really just focus on your demeanor and the way that you're performing with your body. You can also put that video on fast forward. It'll really show you what you're doing and if you're doing something repetitive. So if you're swaying on fast forward, you're going to be swaying super fast, and then you really know, okay, I'm swaying, I need to stop swaying. Or if you use the same hand gesture every 30 seconds, you may not pick up on that if you're just watching it without the audio. But odds are you will if it's on fast forward, because you're going to be doing the same thing every few seconds when it's on fast forward. But not only can you just turn the audio off, you can also turn the video off. So if you turn the audio back on and then you cover up whatever device you're using and you don't look at it and just listen to your voice, it'll give you an insight onto how your voice sounds to people who have never heard it before. You can see if you're sounding super monotone, or if your voice is super high-pitched all of the time, or if you're speaking too fast, or if you're speaking too slow, or if you don't vary your rate enough. Really just turning off the video and listening to yourself allows you to get a little bit of insight into what you sound like to other people, so that way you can try and fix things that you otherwise wouldn't have been aware of. The next thing that you're probably going to want to do is practice a little bit every day. So say you just cannot set aside time to do a full cold reading practice. What you can do is, if you're reading something for school, is to read it aloud. Just get your mind and your mouth familiar with reading something that it doesn't know aloud. Just reading aloud every day will improve your speaking skills across the board greatly and will help you in the cold reading room, even if you didn't set aside time to practice specifically at the event of cold reading. Now, along with that, you also don't want to practice bad habits. So say you're practicing cold reading, but you're kind of doing it in your head. You have the piece of paper in front of you, and you're thinking about the way that you might perform it. Now, that may be good to get the thought process down, but you're not actually practicing how you would perform it. You want to practice speaking out loud. You want to practice making sure you look up and look at the judges, even if they aren't there with you. If you practice bad habits, those habits are going to stick. And then when you get into the competition room, you may think you're looking at more when you're really not, because you practiced staring at that page. So you just want to practice the things that you want to do when you're actually in the competition room. Also, you want to practice reading line by line. This helps with making eye contact with the judges. So instead of trying to read each individual word on the page, you want to read things in phrases or in lines. So that way, as soon as you look up, you don't have to look back down again and see the next words are of the, when you could have remembered that the next words are of the and not had to look down and look up so many times in your speech. So just become familiar with reading line by line so that you're not stuck on each individual little word that you're trying to read. The next thing that you might want to consider doing is practicing your prep times separately. This may be good if you have a super complex system that you've created, like you have a bunch of different highlighters and different marking systems, so that way you can practice doing it within 2 minutes. So you could get a newspaper out and just practice 2 minutes of prep and marking the selection, and then afterwards see if you can go through and understand what you actually meant by all of those markings. Practicing the prep time separately will make sure that you're efficient when you actually get into the competition room and that you actually know what your marks mean instead of standing up there in front of the judges and completely forgetting what a double backslash meant. If you practice it, you'll become more familiar with the system that you've created. You also want to practice how you perform in competition. This kind of ties in with the don't practice bad habits thing. You want to practice with the same amount of energy, the same amount of vocal intensity, and the same amount of intentionality as you would in competition. The more you do that, the stronger you will actually be in competition. Because odds are in competition, you're going to be a little bit quieter. You're going to be a little bit more subdued. So if you practice how you would in competition, it would allow you to compete in the way that you want to instead of maybe being it a little bit less than you thought you would. So those are all of the practice tips that I have for you and the performance tips that I have for you today. Now we're going to move on to an example that I'm going to give you guys. There's no more information here about cold reading and more tips, so if you don't want to see the example, that's fine. You can go ahead and click exit on this video. But next up, we're going to be going over an example. I'll be showing you how I might mark up my page, and then I'll be giving you a piece. Hey guys, so this is the example portion of the cold reading video, but unfortunately both of the printers in my house died, so I'm not going to be able to have a sheet of paper and mark it up as I would in competition, but I'm still going to be here and read you the Gettysburg Address. Now the Gettysburg Address is about half as long as something you would receive in normal competition, so keep in mind that what I'm doing here is about half as long, is about half as much as what you would probably get in competition. Now in the side here, I'm probably going to put some sort of version of what I'm reading up here just so that you guys can see the words that I'm reading, and I may or may not mark that so that way you guys can see how I would mark up my page. But unfortunately both of my printers died and I can't print a page. So I'm just going to be reading it off of my computer, so you're not going to be able to see how I hold it in my hand, unfortunately. But you will be able to see how I read something that I unfortunately haven't read in a long time. So without further ado, let's get started. The Gettysburg Address. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, November 19th of 1863. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on the great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those here who gave their lives for that nation, and so that those of that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note or no longer remember what they say here. but I can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us here to be dedicated to the great task of remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that those for cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Thank you. So that was just a small example of how I might orally give a cold reading. I would probably do a little bit more of gestures, but because you can't really see the rest of my body, you couldn't see that. And I would obviously be holding the piece of paper in my hand. So that is just an example of how you might want to utilize pauses or utilize speeding up and slowing down to go towards the intention of the piece that you're given. I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it was kind of long and you finally survived to the very end. If you liked it, please go ahead and share it with your friends, share it with the rest of your club members. And if you're interested in getting more information like this about cold reading or any other event, we have a couple of workshops that are coming up, and we have a lot of mentors that will be happy to coach you one-on-one for the events that you want to do. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you guys, and hopefully I will see you in a coaching room. Bye.